Hi, everyone. Tanya Hertz here. We are going to be talking this afternoon about power and influence and how we actually use and exert our power and influence. And I just want to make sure that it's clear that power doesn't actually need to be exerted or used in order to have its desired effect. There's a great quote by Dwight Eisenhower when he had left office, and he was asked if leaving office had had an effect on his golf game, and he said yes. Now less people beat me, right? So it's pretty clear that power doesn't actually have to be used in order to be powerful. So let's go ahead and get started on our slides here. Power is that capacity, the capacity to produce the effect on others, or the potential to influence others. And it is power is it's a function of the leader. It's a function of the followers. It's a function of the situation in which the leaders and followers are operating. And all of these have an effect on the amount of power that we can wield. It can either diminish or enhance the potential to influence others. And power is directional, and power is relative. Now, power is different than influence. Power is definitely not the same. It's a wholly separate. It's a separate thing than influence. So, again, power is the so power is the capacity, again, the capacity to influence others, to have an effect on others, or the potential to influence others, while influence is influence. So influence is the change in the target's attitudes, their values, their beliefs, their behaviors as a result of those influence tactics. And I should say this, that we're talking about power very often directionally, where in the leader is affecting the followers, and not the other way around. But it can absolutely be lateral, where we're affecting change or influence on people at our own level, and it can even be affecting change to those higher positions in the organization. All right. So some other important distinctions. Influence is the result, right? The result of those tactics, and the amount of power that followers have in work situations is different from situation to situation, and it depends on large amount the followers' expertise, the amount of time they've been in an organization. So, for example, a new leader can have very little power in an organization, even though they may be higher up in the organization, but they can have very little power compared to a well-respected, long-time employee in an organization who has a high degree of expertise. And so it's important to remember that it's not always tied to positions in an organization. And we know that typically in organizations, the power does tend to flow top down in a hierarchical fashion, but in more and more organizations are taking a more egalitarian approach, where power is distributed more evenly in an organization. And we know that typically when the power is tied to the position in the organization, the leader will typically have a much larger array of tactics which he or she can use to influence behavior, where others may only be able to use a very few type of influence tactics. So it very much depends on a number of different factors, including expertise, including the amount of time somebody's been in an organization, including how well liked that person is. It's not just about the position in the organization. So where does power come from? Well, there are a lot of sources of leader power, and a lot of them are very situational. And these situational factors can have a really big impact on how much power or influence somebody has in an organization, including things like furniture arrangement, seating. Bigger or higher chairs are linked positively to power in an organization. Where specifically we sit. So having a window behind the leader can lead to power. So when a visitor comes into an office and they can't see well and they have to squint to look at the person they're speaking with, that is a way that person can exert power over the other. Having a subordinate stand while you sit, having a force field like a receptionist, so that you can't talk to the person or the leader without first talking to the receptionist. That can add to the power. I was recently at this meeting where I was meeting with the director of a program, and he stayed sitting down when I walked in, and I could tell he was not even really working, but he pretended to work while I was waiting to speak with him. And I came in and said hello, and he put his hand up and said, "I want to talk to you, but wait until I finish." And so he exerted power in that situation. Not always the best way to start a relationship, but at any rate, definitely was exerting some influence there. Office size and type. Having a door that closes can both reflect and affect power. You can dictate when and how you want to interact with someone by closing the door. Sitting at ends of a rectangular table can add to power. Round tables, research suggests, facilitate open discussions and will lead to a more egalitarian, equal distribution of power in an organization. Prominently displayed symbols like plaques and trophies and medals and certificates lead to power. Appearances of title and authority. There was this college classroom research project where the same lecturer was introduced to the classes in several different ways. Well, not to the same class. So he was teaching many different classes, and he would come in, and the first way that they would introduce this lecturer was, they said, here today we have with a student lecturer. The next one was, we have with us a senior lecturer, a distinguished professor. So they introduced him in several different ways before he got up in front of the class to speak. Then afterwards, they asked the classes to estimate how tall he was. Now, when they actually looked back at the numbers, the professor was remembered as several inches taller than when they thought that he was a student. So height is correlated with success and leadership and power. There's another really interesting study where so it was on nurses. It was a researcher who called the nurses line, and he told them that he was a physician, and he told them, give a patient this prescription, which is against the law. They're not allowed to do that. And 95% of the nurses complied with the request, even though the dosage was dangerously high and could potentially even kill the patient, just because he spoke authoritatively and he said that he was a physician, right? Choice of clothing can lead to power. We know that clothing is strongly correlated with power and authority. Police officers, flight attendants. There's this other research study where there's one man who is dressed in a uniform and one man who is dressed in plain clothes. And he told people on the street that somebody was overparked and to give him a dime. Just say, give me a dime. 10% of the people gave him the dime when he was wearing plain clothes. When he was wearing the uniform, 90% of them gave him the money. right? There's so many research studies that have to do with power and clothing. And we know that wearing a suit gives you power. And if you get a chance to read up on the Zimbardo prison experiment, it's an amazing experiment. It was done at Stanford University, and it was done in the late 1970s. And it was I mean, there's so many interesting um, theories that were derived from that experiment. But essentially, it was how people were portrayed. Were they police officers or were they prisoners? And just in having those labels and having those clothes, it was insane where that research study went. Couldn't happen today. But watch, there's also a great movie on this on Netflix on the Zimbardo prison experiment. Another thing that can add to add to power or the ability to exert influence is the presence or absence of a crisis. I don't know if you've heard that saying, never let a crisis go to waste. We know that leaders can exert power in a crisis, and unethical politicians use this quite a bit. They use fear to push their agendas, and some of the most just shocking regulatory changes happened during a crisis, which would never ever happen in a period of calm. So, moving on. Okay, gestures of power are there's some gestures that we can use to express non-verbally power or exert our power or influence over others. Children are taught not to stare, but staring is often a sign of power, especially in Western cultures. And so, we say for kids not to stare, but when superiors in organizations, they're not bound by the same restrictions. There's research done on how much eye contact leaders make, and it's really interesting that leaders will often not make as much eye contact with subordinates. There's a lot of really interesting studies, but one where on virtual calls, leaders will often look away, almost as if they're disinterested, and the same behavior wouldn't be tolerated in subordinates, right? Really interesting. Also, things like touching, right? Touching or pointing. So touching is really closely linked to socioeconomic status, and rich people are much more likely to touch poor people than the other way around. Bosses or teachers might pat a subordinate on the back, but you would never see a subordinate patting a leader on the back. And there are other things that come into play there, including whether or not it's appropriate to touch any employee. Men are more likely than women to interrupt in a conversation, and interrupting another person is a sign of dominance or control over another person. Now, just because these kinds of gestures of power might show that somebody has more power, it's not always appropriate to use these types of so don't think of them as so much as tactics, right? As tactics. Now, it's also important, though, there are things that you can do that can exert power or show that you have power. And if you take my video is not on, it keeps cutting off, but if you take a powerful stance, so standing up straight, being faking confidence is often enough to give you that power or give you that control in a situation. So excuse me. So having that upright, straight posture can give you power. It also makes you appear taller, which taller people taller people are, research shows that they tend to have more power, make more money, emerge as leaders in organizations. Yeah. There are many things that we can do with our hands, with our bodies, to make ourselves seem more powerful. And again, confidence is one of those things. We can't tell whether confidence is real or confidence is something that's fake. So there are 5 primary types of power that we'll look at, and we can break them into 2 categories, and those are organizational and personal, and we'll go through them one by one, and I think we're going to do that on the next slide here. So I'll see you in just a moment there, and see you at the next video.